Everyone remembers the 1960s as the decade where westerns started to fade. Critics said the genre was old, dying, and out of step with modern audiences. But guess what? They were wrong. Some of the most daring, powerful, and flat-out entertaining westerns ever made came from this exact decade. Want proof? Let's dig into 15 westerns from the 1960s that are still worth watching today. Some are obvious classics, but others might surprise you. The Magnificent Seven, 1960. Here's the one everyone knows, but few truly understand. The Magnificent Seven wasn't just a remake of Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. It was Hollywood's way of saying, we can do it bigger, louder, and with more gunsmoke. Directed by John Sturges, this film assembled an all-star cast: Yul Brynner, Steve McQueen, Charles Bronson, James Coburn, and more. At the time, most of these names were not yet icons, but this movie pushed them into orbit. The plot is simple on the surface. A poor Mexican village hires 7 gunslingers to protect them from bandits. But what makes the film sing is the chemistry between the men. McQueen constantly tried to upstage Brynner on set, fiddling with his hat and making sure the camera caught him even when he had no lines. Brynner hated it. That tension? You can feel it in every scene, and it gives the film an edge. Elmer Bernstein's thundering score might be the most famous Western soundtrack not written by Ennio Morricone. It's still used in commercials, parades, and even car ads decades later. Critics were lukewarm at first, calling it flashy but shallow. But audiences? They made it a hit. And with time, it became a benchmark for action films everywhere. Think The Dirty Dozen. Think Ocean's 11. That whole assemble the team formula owes something to this movie. Is it better than Kurosawa's original? Number. But is it a Western that's still thrilling, stylish, and endlessly rewatchable? Absolutely. The Magnificent Seven didn't just open the decade. It kicked the saloon doors wide open. One-Eyed Jacks, 1961. Marlon Brando directing a Western? That was never supposed to happen. This was originally going to be a Stanley Kubrick project, but Kubrick walked away 2 weeks before shooting began. Suddenly, Brando found himself behind the camera, rewriting the script as he went, and ballooning the schedule into a year-long chaos. The result? One-Eyed Jacks, the only film Brando ever directed. On paper, it's a standard revenge story. Brando plays Rio, an outlaw betrayed by his partner, played by Karl Malden. Years later, Rio comes back for vengeance, but nothing plays out the way you expect. Brando refused to shoot quick takes. He demanded long, slow scenes where emotion did the heavy lifting. The film runs at its own pace, heavy with silence and close-ups that would have been cut in any other Western. The studio eventually yanked the final cut away from Brando and hacked it down. Brando hated the released version. Critics dismissed it, and it flopped. But here's where things get interesting. Decades later, directors like Scorsese and Tarantino championed it, calling it visually stunning and emotionally unique. Scorsese even helped restore it for modern audiences. There's a moment in the film where Brando eats a banana in the middle of a tense scene. It sounds ridiculous, but it's pure Brando, casual, unpredictable, magnetic. That sums up the whole movie. One-Eyed Jacks isn't polished like The Magnificent Seven. It's messy, eccentric, and sometimes self-indulgent, but it's also hypnotic. This isn't just Brando's only directorial work. It's a rare look at what a Western could be if you handed the reins to an actor who refused to follow the rules. Ride the High Country, 1962. Sam Peckinpah didn't storm into Hollywood with blood-soaked mayhem right away. Before The Wild Bunch, he gave us Ride the High Country, a quiet, reflective Western that feels more like a farewell than a gunfight. This was his second feature, and it's arguably one of the most poetic Westerns of the entire decade. The film stars Randolph Scott and Joel McCrea, two aging icons of the genre, playing old lawmen taking one last job, transporting gold through dangerous territory. Scott and McCrea weren't just acting, they were living symbols of an older Hollywood. By 1962, both were nearing the end of their careers. Scott even retired after seeing the finished film, saying he couldn't top it. On the surface, it's about two men guarding a shipment. But beneath that, it's about morality, loyalty, and the slow death of the Old West. Peckinpah crafts it like a eulogy, a meditation on what it means when the world moves on without you. And unlike many 60s westerns, it's not about flashy gunfights or revenge. The power here comes from restraint. The production itself wasn't glamorous. The budget was small, and MGM didn't know how to market it. They stuck it on double bills with cheap comedies, thinking no one would care. But word of mouth spread. Critics started calling it one of the finest westerns of the era, and over time, it built a reputation as the film that showed Peckinpah's true potential. If you only know Peckinpah for slow-motion shootouts and gallons of blood, Ride the High Country will surprise you. It's tender, moving, and built on the shoulders of two men who knew their time in the saddle was nearly over. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, 1962. John Ford was no stranger to westerns, but by 1962, he wasn't interested in making another ride into the sunset story. Instead, he gave us The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, a film that pulls apart the very myths he helped create. This is the Western, where the legend itself is put on trial. James Stewart plays Ransom Stoddard, an Eastern lawyer who comes to a rough Western town and immediately clashes with Liberty Valance, a brutal outlaw played with feral energy by Lee Marvin. Standing in between them is John Wayne as Tom Doniphan, a rugged rancher who represents the Old West in all its blunt, violent honesty. Here's the setup. Stewart's character becomes famous as the man who shot Liberty Valance. But as the story unfolds, we learn that fame is built on a lie. The real shooter wasn't who the world thinks it was. That revelation flips the entire movie, forcing audiences to ask, what matters more, the truth or the legend? Ford shot the film in black and white, even though color was standard by then. Why? Because he wanted grit, shadows, and the feeling of something stripped down to its bones. Critics at the time were divided. Some thought it was too talky, too slow, but later generations recognized it as one of the most important westerns ever made. That famous line, "When the legend becomes fact, print the legend," still echoes today. This film isn't about shootouts, though there are some tense ones. It's about politics, myth-making, and the uncomfortable truth that heroes aren't always who we think they are. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance isn't just another Western. It's the Western that dares to admit the stories we celebrate might be built on lies. How the West Was Won, 1962. Sometimes Hollywood doesn't just make a film, they make an event. How the West Was Won was one of those spectacles. Released in 1962, it wasn't a standard Western. It was a massive, multi-generational epic designed to show off the new Cinerama process. That meant 3 cameras, stitched together on a giant curved screen, and an audience experience that was overwhelming in scale. The film itself spans decades, following one family through the settlement of the American frontier. It's divided into 5 segments, each directed by a different Hollywood heavyweight: John Ford, Henry Hathaway, and George Marshall. The cast list is basically a hall of fame. James Stewart, John Wayne, Gregory Peck, Henry Fonda, Debbie Reynolds, and Spencer Tracy as narrator. You don't get more star power than that. Of course, when you pile this much talent together, the film doesn't always feel consistent. Some segments soar, others drag. But what makes it worth watching isn't just the story. It's the sheer ambition. The wide, sweeping landscapes practically spill off the screen, and the action sequences feel gigantic in a way most westerns couldn't match. The production was grueling. The 3-camera system was so complicated that actors had to hit marks perfectly or risk looking distorted. John Ford, who directed the Civil War segment, reportedly hated the technical headaches. But when it all came together, audiences were stunned. It won 3 Oscars and became one of the decade's highest-grossing films. Is it subtle? Not at all. But if you want to see Hollywood flex its muscles and remind the world that westerns could still be larger than life, How the West Was Won is the proof. It's less a movie than a cinematic monument. HUD, 1963. Not every Western wears a cowboy hat and rides into the sunset. Hud is one of those films that sneaks in through the back door of the genre. It doesn't have sweeping gunfights or frontier showdowns. Instead, it gives us Paul Newman in one of his most ruthless roles, a modern cowboy who doesn't care about honor, loyalty, or family. Hud Bannon is a Texas rancher's son who does everything for himself. He drinks too much, fights with everyone around him, and sees the family land not as heritage, but as property to be exploited. Opposite him is his aging father, played by Melvyn Douglas, who represents old-fashioned integrity and decency. The tension between them isn't just family drama, it's a clash of values. Old West tradition versus modern selfishness. Filmed in stark black and white, Hud looks more like a 1950s drama than a colorful Western. But that decision makes it even more powerful. The barren landscapes reflect the emptiness of Newman's character. Critics at the time were shocked by just how unlikable Hud was. Newman was already a star, yet here he plays a man with no redeeming qualities. And somehow, audiences couldn't look away. The film swept awards, with Patricia Neal and Melvyn Douglas both winning Oscars for their performances. Newman didn't win, but he left a mark with a character who felt all too real. Hud isn't heroic. He isn't noble. He's the future, ugly, selfish, and unstoppable. If most 60s Westerns tried to hang on to myths of honor, Hud smashed those myths into dust. It's a modern Western that proves sometimes the most dangerous outlaw is the one living under your own roof. McClintock. 1963. Not every Western in the 60s was grim and brooding. McClintock reminded audiences that the genre could still have fun. This was John Wayne leaning into comedy without losing his tough guy swagger, and it worked. The movie became one of his most popular releases of the decade, and surprisingly, it still holds up as pure entertainment. Wayne plays George Washington McClintock, a wealthy cattle baron trying to manage a town full of problems while also dealing with his fiery estranged wife, played by Maureen O'Hara. Their back-and-forth banter is the film's heartbeat. The two had already starred together in several films, and their chemistry is electric. You believe every insult, every spark, every laugh. The movie is loosely based on Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew, but set in the Wild West. Instead of royal courts, you get saloons, ranches, and big brawls in the mud. Yes, there's an actual mud fight scene, and it goes on forever in the best way possible. Extras, stars, townsfolk, everyone ends up covered head to toe, and the audience loved it. Critics at the time didn't take it seriously, brushing it off as Wayne just fooling around. But McClintock was a huge box office success. It showed that Westerns didn't always have to be grim morality plays or violent revenge sagas. Sometimes they could just be rollicking good fun. Does it carry the same dramatic weight as Liberty Valance or Ride the High Country? Number. But McClintock gave audiences what they wanted. John Wayne, punching, laughing, and running his town with that larger-than-life presence nobody else could match. Sometimes, that's all a Western needs. Cheyenne Autumn, 1964. By 1964, John Ford had directed more Westerns than most directors had films. He made stars out of John Wayne, shaped the genre's identity, and built myths that still linger today. But with Cheyenne Autumn, Ford tried something different. He turned the camera toward Native Americans, telling their story with sympathy instead of stereotypes. The film dramatizes the Cheyenne tribe's 1878 trek from an Oklahoma reservation back to their homeland in Wyoming. Starving and desperate, they defied government orders and set out on a long, punishing journey. Instead of focusing on cowboys or outlaws, Ford centers the narrative on the Cheyenne people themselves. It was a bold move for a director known for showing Native Americans mostly as faceless enemies in his earlier films. The production was massive. Ford shot in Monument Valley again, but this time the sweeping landscapes were meant to highlight suffering and survival instead of heroic conquest. The cast included Richard Widmark and Carol Baker, but much of the emotional weight came from the Native American characters, portrayed with a dignity rarely seen in mainstream Westerns of the time. Was it perfect? Number Hollywood still cast white actors in some native roles, and critics pointed that out immediately. The film didn't do well at the box office either. Audiences weren't ready for a revisionist Western that stripped away the usual thrills. But Ford himself considered it one of his most important works, and over time, it's been reassessed as a flawed but significant attempt to reshape the genre. Cheyenne Autumn doesn't deliver shootouts or classic John Wayne swagger. What it delivers is something far rarer for the era, a Western that dares to tell the story from the other side. The Sons of Katie Elder, 1965. If you wanted a classic John Wayne Western in the 60s, this was the one. The Sons of Katie Elder checked all the boxes: a tough hero, a family revenge story, and just enough grit to keep audiences hooked. Directed by Henry Hathaway, the film paired Wayne with Dean Martin, and together they brought a mix of seriousness and charm to the screen. The setup is simple but strong. Four brothers return to their hometown of Clearwater, Texas, for their mother's funeral. Katie Elder was beloved, but her sons haven't lived up to her legacy. They're drifters, gamblers, and troublemakers. Still, when they discover their family ranch has been stolen by a corrupt land baron, they band together to set things right. Wayne's character, John Elder, is the anchor of the group, tough, moral, and ready to fight for justice. Dean Martin adds humor and swagger, giving the movie a lighter touch without undercutting its serious themes. The supporting cast, including George Kennedy, keeps the stakes high with plenty of tension and action. Behind the scenes, Wayne was battling health issues, having recently undergone surgery for lung cancer. Yet he pushed through, delivering a commanding performance that reminded audiences why he was still the face of the Western. The film wasn't groundbreaking, but it didn't need to be. It was a box office success and proved audiences still wanted straightforward, action-driven Westerns, even as the genre was shifting. The Sons of Katie Elder is less about innovation and more about execution. It gave audiences everything they expected from a John Wayne picture and delivered it with polish. Sometimes, a Western doesn't have to rewrite the rules. It just has to ride tall in the saddle. This one does. Shenandoah, 1965. James Stewart had already played a wide range of Western roles, but Shenandoah gave him something different. This wasn't a story about lawmen, outlaws, or gold. It was about a farmer trying to keep his family safe in the middle of the Civil War, refusing to take sides until the war came crashing through his front door. Stewart plays Charlie Anderson, a Virginia widower raising 6 sons and a daughter. He insists on staying neutral. He doesn't own slaves, he doesn't believe in the Confederacy, and he doesn't trust the Union. For him, the war is other people's problem, but neutrality doesn't last long. When Union soldiers capture his youngest son, Charlie is dragged into a conflict he desperately wanted to avoid. Unlike most Westerns of the era, Shenandoah is deeply anti-war. It doesn't glorify battles or paint clear heroes and villains. Instead, it shows how ordinary families get torn apart by forces they can't control. Stewart anchors the whole film with his trademark blend of warmth and steel, delivering one of the most emotional performances of his career. The production wasn't flashy. Directed by Andrew V. McLaglen, known more for TV work, the film keeps things simple. But its message landed hard, especially in 1965, when America was escalating its involvement in Vietnam. Audiences couldn't miss the parallels. Shenandoah became a box office success, proving that audiences still wanted thoughtful Westerns alongside the more traditional shoot-'em-ups. Stewart himself later called it one of his personal favorites. Shenandoah doesn't end with triumph or easy answers. It ends with loss, sacrifice, and the haunting reminder that war always finds its way home. That's what makes it linger. The Professionals, 1966. If you want a Western that moves like an action thriller, The Professionals is it. Directed by Richard Brooks, this one takes the old rescue mission formula and cranks it up with grit, explosions, and one of the strongest casts of the decade. Burt Lancaster, Lee Marvin, Robert Ryan, and Woody Strode headline as mercenaries hired to retrieve a kidnapped woman from a Mexican bandit played by Jack Palance. That lineup alone is worth the ticket. The film leans hard into the assemble the team formula, much like the Magnificent Seven or the Dirty Dozen. Each man brings a different skill, and watching them clash, cooperate, and banter is half the fun. Lancaster steals scenes with his charisma, Marvin broods with quiet intensity, and Strode shows why he was one of the most underrated screen presences of his era. Even Palance, playing the villain, brings an odd charm to his role. The action sequences are still impressive. Shootouts are staged with precision, explosions punctuate the desert landscapes, and Brooks balances suspense with sharp dialogue. Critics at the time noted how unusually violent it was for a mainstream studio western, but that edge is what gives it staying power. Nominated for 3 Oscars, including Best Director and Best Screenplay. The Professionals didn't get buried like so many 60s westerns. It was a hit. Still, it often gets overshadowed today by the Leone films or John Wayne's late career efforts. But make no mistake, this is one of the slickest, smartest western adventures of the 1960s. If The Magnificent Seven was about reluctant heroes, The Professionals is about men who know exactly who they are and don't apologize for it. El Dorado, 1966. Howard Hawks had already made Rio Bravo in 1959, and by the mid-60s, he decided to revisit the formula with El Dorado. Some call it a remake, others call it a reworking. But either way, it gave audiences another chance to see John Wayne at his most confident, this time paired with Robert Mitchum in one of the most entertaining buddy westerns of the decade. The setup is classic. Wayne plays Cole Thornton, a hired gun who turns down a job once he learns it would pit him against an old friend. But when that friend, Sheriff J.P. Hara, played by Mitchum, falls into drunken ruin, Thornton steps in to help him clean up the town. Along the way, they're joined by a young James Caan in one of his earliest major roles, adding youthful energy to balance Wayne and Mitchum's gravitas. El Dorado isn't groundbreaking, but that's not the point. Hawks knew exactly how to stage camaraderie, suspense, and action without wasting time. The dialogue is sharp, the pacing brisk, and the chemistry between Wayne and Mitchum is undeniable. Watching Wayne's steady dominance play off Mitchum's vulnerable sheriff is where the film really shines. Audiences responded positively, though some critics dismissed it as Rio Bravo light. Over time, however, El Dorado has earned respect as a classic in its own right. It's not as heavy or mythic as Liberty Valance, nor as daring as Peckinpah's later work, but it's a western that knows its job. Entertain. If Rio Bravo is the blueprint, El Dorado is the remix. Different flavor, same satisfying punch. Sometimes that's all you need. Hour of the Gun, 1967. By the late 60s, Western audiences had seen the OK Corral gunfight retold countless times. Most versions stopped at the shootout itself, treating it as the climax. John Sturges, who had already directed Gunfight at the OK Corral a decade earlier, decided to do something different with Hour of the Gun. This time, the story begins after the famous battle and focuses on the messy aftermath. James Garner takes the role of Wyatt Earp, delivering a performance that strips away the heroic polish and replaces it with obsession and steel. Jason Robards plays Doc Holliday, bringing a darker, more cynical edge than audiences were used to. Together, the two navigate a West that feels far more corrupt and unforgiving than in earlier Hollywood versions. The film presents Earp not as a noble lawman, but as a man consumed by vengeance, hunting down the Clanton gang with a single-minded ruthlessness. It's a more modern, revisionist take, and that honesty turned some viewers off at the time. Critics complained it was too dry, too procedural, lacking the romantic flair of earlier adaptations. But with hindsight, Hour of the Gun stands out as one of the boldest retellings of the Wyatt Earp legend. It doesn't glorify violence. It doesn't hand out easy victories. Instead, it shows how the line between lawman and outlaw can blur until you can't tell the difference. It flopped at the box office, overshadowed by lighter westerns and emerging parodies, but today it's recognized as a daring step forward. If you want the truth behind the legend, or at least a version closer to it, Hour of the Gun is essential viewing. Support your local sheriff. 1969. By the late 1960s, the Western was starting to buckle under its own seriousness. Revisionist dramas, violent epics, and spaghetti imports had all taken their toll. So along came Support Your Local Sheriff, a film that reminded everyone the genre could laugh at itself. Directed by Burt Kennedy and starring James Garner, it's one of the best Western comedies ever made. Garner plays Jason McCullough, a drifter who wanders into town just in time to be offered the job of sheriff. The town is broke, the jail isn't even finished, and the place is crawling with outlaws. McCullough takes the job anyway, using quick wit and clever tricks instead of brute force to keep order. The humor is smart, but never mocking. It plays with every cliché: duels, corrupt landowners, nervous deputies, and turns them on their head. There's even a running gag where Garner keeps locking people in a jail cell that doesn't have bars yet, and somehow they stay put, because he's that convincing. Audiences loved it. The film was a hit, proving that even at the end of the decade, Westerns could adapt. It didn't preach, didn't brood, and didn't drown in blood. It just entertained. Garner's charm carries the whole thing, showing why he was one of the most versatile actors of the era. Critics later pointed out that Support Your Local Sheriff may have been one of the first true self-aware Westerns. It understood the tropes so well it could poke fun at them while still delivering a satisfying story. If you were burned out on grim morality tales, this was the cure. Sometimes, the smartest way to save a genre is to laugh with it, not at it. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, 1966. We said we'd include just one spaghetti western, and this is the one. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly isn't just a film, it's a seismic shift in how the world saw westerns. Directed by Sergio Leone, it transformed Clint Eastwood into a global star, gave us Ennio Morricone's most iconic score, and set the standard for epic, operatic gunfights. The setup is as simple as the title: three men, Blondie by Eastwood, Tuco played by Eli Wallach, and Angel Eyes by Lee Van Cleef, compete to find a buried fortune during the chaos of the Civil War. But it's not about the plot. It's about the way Leone tells it. Long, drawn-out standoffs, extreme close-ups that turn eyes and sweat into landscapes, silence stretched until you can barely breathe, then shattered by thunderous gunfire. The production was chaotic. Shot in Spain with Italian financing, it pushed actors and crew through brutal heat and constant improvisation. Eastwood wasn't a fan of Leone's endless retakes, and Wallach barely survived some dangerous stunts. But somehow, all that tension bled into the film itself, giving it a raw energy no studio western could touch. Critics in America didn't get it at first, dismissing it as violent pulp. But audiences knew better. The movie became a phenomenon, and over time, critics caught up. Today, it's considered one of the greatest films ever made, western or otherwise. That final three-way duel in the cemetery? It's been copied, parodied, and paid tribute to endlessly. And Morricone's score, whistling, chanting, pounding, remains one of the most recognizable pieces of music in cinema history. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly didn't just close out the decade. It rewrote the rules of the Western forever. So there you have it. 15 Westerns from the 1960s that prove the genre wasn't dying. It was reinventing itself. From John Wayne's larger-than-life swagger to Leone's gritty revolution, the decade gave us stories that still ride tall today. Which one of these have you seen? And which deserves a modern comeback? Drop your thoughts below. Share this with a fellow movie fan, and don't forget to subscribe for more cinematic deep dives. The West still has stories to tell.